Hi everyone, it's Kurt here again for another video for our Teaching Methods and Materials course. This time our topic is teaching grammar and vocabulary. As always, our material comes from our textbook Teaching by Principles by Brown and Lee. So this topic is a pretty important one because, as all of you know, the focus in English classes in Taiwan is primarily on grammar and vocabulary. At least it has been traditionally. And it's still a very important topic, right? These are the building blocks of language. You need to be able to use the language effectively, efficiently, accurately in order to communicate. Just keep in mind as we're going through the slides here today that there may be some different ways that you never thought of. So keep your mind open. But more importantly, think about this. When we're teaching grammar, it's for more communicative purposes because we want to be able to use the language communicatively, right? Our focus in this class is communicative language teaching. So how can we teach grammar so that students notice it and so they're able to acquire it and use it for their writing and their speaking? Okay, so here we go. Okay, so when we're talking about grammar, there are three dimensions that you should keep in mind. The first is the form. Okay, so that's the observable structural components, the phonemes, the graphemes, inflectional morphemes, syntactic patterns, and so on and so on. So that is our form. So whenever I say focus on form, that's what we're talking about. Okay, the second is meaning. So this is the semantic level. This is our lexical and grammatical meaning, right? Lexical meaning, of course, we're talking about the words. Grammatical meaning, maybe when we use inflections like past tense or plurals, things like that. Okay, and then use. So these are meanings across different contexts, and students need to know this as well. So here's an example. Get out of here. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, literally, it means get out of here. But it could also mean, oh, you must be kidding me. Like if somebody says something very surprising, say, get out of here. Like, come on, I don't believe you. And on and on. There are many meanings of this one, actually. You could look this one up. Okay. So another thing to think about is discourse. So discourse is speech or writing with internal relationships of form and meaning that relate to a function or purpose in an audience in a particular context. Okay, so discourse is all of it, right? It's the text, it's the connected sentences together. Okay, and then context. So we're talking about context. These are all of the things that are included inside. So the speaker or the writer, who's the audience, what communication takes place before and after a sentence, implied versus literal meaning. So I just showed you the example of get out of here. Styles, the registers, the alternative forms available. Why did you choose this particular form and not that particular form? Who is it that you're speaking to? Maybe there's some social linguistic variance there due to who's in this conversation. We're talking about the distance between two people, the power levels, lots of things going on. Okay, so I want to start at the very beginning now. We're talking about emergent grammar. So this is at the very, very, very beginning level. And what we know is that grammar emerges through repeated use. And that's why when you teach young children or new beginners, you need to get them to use the language as much as possible, because the more they use it, the more the grammar is going to emerge. Okay, so I have this term from the book called grammaring. It means using grammar in real-world communicative contexts. And in this way, it treats grammar as a skill, not knowledge. And I think that's totally opposite from the way that you learned, most of you, in that you're learning the knowledge. Here's the rules, this is what it looks like. Not necessarily a skill. Okay. And the process of using grammar constructions accurately, meaningfully, and appropriately. Now, there's this misconception, I think, that if you don't teach all the rules directly, that you can't learn how to use the language accurately. But actually, if you practice using the language, you're also going to learn how to use the grammar, even though you may not be only focusing on the rules. So maybe there needs to be a balance between the two. Just think of your native language. You learned your grammar through using the language and hearing other people talk. That's the way that you learned grammar. You didn't learn grammar of Mandarin by focusing on the rules, right? So even though it's not as easy in a second language because you don't get as many opportunities to hear and use it. So you need that focus on the rules as well, but it can't just be that. Okay, so let's look at some approaches to form-focused instruction. So that means the grammar, right? We're getting our students to focus on the grammar. How can we do that? Okay, so there are a few different approaches here. So explicit presentations of forms are good because they help learners develop a metalinguistic awareness of a rule that can be carried deductively or inductively. Now, if you use a deductive approach, the teacher will begin the lesson by presenting the grammar focus, okay? So here's the grammar that we're going to learn today, okay? And then the teacher gives examples to the students, and then the teacher follows up at the end with explicit rule explanation. Okay. Oops. Okay, if you use the inductive way, the teacher tries to elicit grammatical information from the students by providing examples. So you give them the text, you give them some sentences to look at, and they use the language, and then you hope that they learn it without pointing it out to them. Okay, there's a third one called abduction. Now this is trying out tentative solutions to problems or facts to figure out what may happen, to see if they work, or to experience something new. So in this way, what you're doing is you're asking students to try to understand the hidden rules of language through the process of exploring hypotheses and inferences. So I know that may not be so clear. So here's some examples. So what you're trying to do is get students to figure out the rule on their own. So it's kind of a mix between inductive and deductive in that you're not telling them the rule, but you want them to learn it by looking at the text. Okay, so this is how you could run abduction. You give students an authentic text with some features you want them to learn. So whatever it is, present progressive, the simple past, whatever. Make sure it's in there a lot. Then you design an activity that forces the students to focus on the features. Students work in groups and note the grammatical patterns or features they observe, and then they report their findings to the class. So in this way, you are asking students to search and figure out, how come the verbs are all different in this one? So there must be some rule, and they try to figure it out on their own. So it's inductive in that students collect further examples and try to make a rule, and then deductive, the teacher and students make a rule together and check it in the book. So at the end, you're still covering both inductive and deductive, but having students try it out, try to learn it on their own. Okay, so now let's talk about actually explaining the grammar to your students. Okay, so here's some suggestions. First of all, keep your explanation brief and simple, and use your L1 if needed or allowed. Of course, it's allowed here. I've watched a lot of teachers teach grammar, and they spend a lot of time talking and a lot of time talking about the rules. If you talk too much and make it too complicated, you've lost your students. They're not going to be able to follow. Even if you use Chinese, it's too much. Nobody likes to listen to grammar for too long. It's hard to keep your focus. So keep it brief, keep it simple, and then give them a chance to use it. Use visuals to explain. That's very helpful. Charts, graphs, posters, whatever way you can use the new online software. There's a lot of them that are great for organizing on the screen. It's probably better than writing on the chalkboard. Use clear, unambiguous examples. I can't stress this enough. Your examples have to be very clear and unambiguous, and they have to match exactly what it is that you're saying. Another thing is, in English, we have a lot of exceptions to the rule. Don't focus too much on those. It's confusing for students. Just deal with them when they show up. And the last point is really important. Don't teach something that you're not sure of. If students ask you a question and you're not 100% sure, it's okay to tell them, you know what? I think I got it, but let me double check for you and I'll get back to you. Or if you're too embarrassed to say you don't know, You can say, you know what, that's a great question. Right now, I want to focus on this. I'll get back to that later. And then that gives you it gives you time to think about it or look it up if you have to. It's okay. Everybody goes through this where they don't know the answer to the question. Okay, so approaches to form-focused instruction. So now we're looking at implicit presentation of forms. So as I told you, when we do this type of implicit inductive learning, you don't explain the rules to them. The target form is included in the class materials, and the students learn through usage in appropriate context. So if you think back to the class where we talked about task-based teaching, and I gave you all a reading text on whales. Here's an example. If there's a form in there, like that one was full of comparative and superlative forms. I didn't directly teach those to you. You read the text, and then that form is in there and they use it. I start asking questions. Which is bigger, a whale or a dinosaur? Which is the biggest? Which is the smallest whale? They start to use the forms just from reading. Okay, so here's an example of how to do that. In this particular one, I want to present the present progressive tense, so I'm speaking now, I'm not reading. Suji is sitting on a chair now, not standing on it. We are studying English now, we are not watching TV, and on and on. So this is something I would have them read. Okay, focus on form. So it's really, really important no matter what way you use. You want to use deductive, you want to use inductive, you want to use abductive, it doesn't matter. Somehow you have to get them to focus on the form if you want them to really acquire the skill or the knowledge. So attempts to induce learners incidental learning by drawing their attention to target forms while in communicative activities. So first, induce students' incidental learning by drawing their attention to forms while performing communicative activities. Second, students must notice the forms and their lack of ability in it. They need to notice the gap. It's the best way for anyone to learn something is when they perform it themselves and then they see what we call a better other or more knowledgeable other do it. And then they have to be able to see the difference. Now, this is not always easy to do because it depends on a student's motivation, their anxiety, and things like that. Okay, so what are the benefits of having your students actually focus on the form? So first of all, it's similar to natural language acquisition. There's little focus on the rules because this way that you're doing it is you're implicitly giving them the grammar but still having them focus on it. Now, what I mean by that is, go back to my whale text, and I'm talking about superlatives. How do I get them to notice those forms? Well, like I said, I asked them questions. So what is the largest whale? They need to go back to the text, and they see it. Oh, the largest whale is the blue whale. What is the smallest whale? The smallest whale is I forget, dwarf something or nurse something. I forget what it is. That's how you get them to focus on it. So what they're doing is they're learning to use it by communicating, and they're not learning the specific rule. Now, maybe you need to give them feedback. So if you have a written question and they don't say the biggest, they just say biggest whale is, then that's where you give them feedback and you show them it's the biggest. When they get it back, they say, oh, or the student says it orally. Oh, teacher, biggest whale is blue whale. And then the teacher says, almost, can someone else do it? And then a better student says, oh, the biggest is the blue whale. So we're hoping that that student notices that the other student is using the. And the more you practice it, the more everyone will start to acquire it. But I didn't actually teach the rule. Okay. So it promotes the idea of interlanguage development. Interlanguage is when you are learning a new language, your grammar is a little bit mixed up, and as you keep learning, it starts to sort itself out and it starts to become more correct. You have a lot of mistakes, word orders mixed up, you forget articles, but the more you use it, the more you develop along this continuum where those mistakes eventually go away. It allows students a chance to try out the language without being overwhelmed by rules, and there's more intrinsic motivation. Students discover rules instead of being told them. This is actually something that is very beneficial for students. Okay, but like I said, learners need to compare their answers to the correct form at the end of the task and notice the gaps between their responses and the correct answers. They have to see it. And then at this time, if they have questions, that's when you can go back and say, yeah, the rule is, and then you can do it that way. So you can try this instead of just starting with the rule first. Try to get the students involved with the text, involved with the form first, and then let them use it. And then maybe at the end you can go back and look at the rules. Okay, so now I want to talk about giving feedback on errors. So you want to give a variety of different feedback options. We're talking grammar, right? So you can do what we call recasting, where a student says, I go to school. You say, you go to school, and then have them focus. You can do another one, which is, you can directly hit the spot, where you say, what's the past tense of go? And there's lots of different ways. You can have students self-correct. There's something wrong with your sentence. Can you find it? You can give them a meta-linguistic explanation. Doesn't matter. There's lots of different ways, and you should mix it up from time to time. Keep the communicative flow going, maximize student self-correction, and consider their affective factors. So you don't want to hurt them. You don't want to make them feel bad. And balance between local and global errors. Local errors are those very small ones. Global are the ones that hurt the meaning or the communication. Try not to only focus on local, because as you'll find out, even when you correct their local errors, like let's say third person singular, that's a big one, junior high school, senior high school. Even though you correct it and you tell them the rule, they just haven't acquired that knowledge yet, and it takes time, it takes practice. And so if you keep focusing on it, actually, it might not really help that much. Now, I'm not saying ignore it, but it's okay to bring it up, but focus more on those larger global errors, like something that totally destroys the meaning or the tense and things like that. Okay, here's an example that the book gives. It's a regulatory scale of implicit to explicit feedback that you can give. So I'll just leave it. It's here for your own reference. But you can see like the first one, the tutor asks the learner to read, find the errors, and correct them independently. And then you go down to number 12. The tutor provides examples of the correct pattern when other forms of help fail to produce. So at the very end, all right, here's the answer. So you can see step by step, here are some things you can try. Those of you who are tutoring right now, you may want to try to adopt some of these. Okay, the next thing that I wanted to bring up in the book talks about it is the lexical grammatical approach, which means lexis and grammar are inherently connected parts of a single entity, and you cannot actually separate them. It's kind of like what I talk about reading and writing. It's hard to separate the two. So here's a quote from Halliday. Grammar is a meaning-making resource to describe grammatical categories by reference to what they mean. Okay, and then grammatical structures are lexically bound, and lexical items have grammatical features. So it's really hard to separate vocabulary and grammar. The two kind of go hand in hand. So there is an approach where the teacher focuses on both at the same time instead of trying to separate the two. Okay, so let's move on to principles for teaching grammar. So all three dimensions of grammar should be focused on: the form, the meaning, and the use. You can use a lexical grammatical approach to present new linguistic items. Learners need to practice and use forms in a communicative context. This part is really important. Remember, that's not only speaking, writing as well. Allow students to have both input and output. Deductive, inductive, and abductive approaches can be used depending on goals and context. So I won't say one is better than the other. But I do think that you need to have some chance for students to implicitly learn the grammar. It can't always be just explicit instruction or explicit explanation of the grammar forms. You should allow them to try to acquire these grammar forms on their own by using the language. And I think that's one of the parts that's really lacking in the classrooms. Okay, incidental focus on form helps when learners' errors are treated when engaged in meaningful communication. Corrective feedback should include implicit and explicit forms. Grammar lessons should include both explicit and implicit in communicative activities. And then instruction must consider learners' differences, of course. Some learners have different learning styles, different abilities, and you need to consider that. Okay, so how to teach grammar. There are a few different techniques that you can use. I'm going to show examples of all of them or most of them here. So the first one is charts, objects, maps, drawings. I think this probably looks very familiar to something you've seen in the past. You have some visual help, some scaffolding for the students so that they can kind of figure it out. Now, I know everyone has their own way. I'm not going to show a lot of examples here, but I think you get the idea. So students can see here the adverbs of frequency. They choose the appropriate one. Down below, they have some example sentences, and then students can say or write them. Okay, I strongly suggest that when you do this in the future, that you also have some chances for them to speak these sentences out, not just write them on a worksheet. Okay, second one is dialogues and conversation. It's kind of hard to read, but you know, if we want to present, you see up here, this is present progressive and future events. So what are you doing next week? So we use the dialogue to teach the present progressive tense. A lot of EFL, ESL textbooks use this way. The dialogue is on the first page, and then the actual example sentence patterns are on the next page with the vocabulary. So this is a way to contextualize the grammar, right? You see it in a dialogue, and then on the next page you have the same vocabulary and the same grammar points, and then maybe there's a reading section after also with those grammar forms inside. So as a teacher, you don't have to explicitly teach in the beginning because they're going to see those forms all over the place. Okay, the next one is called input enhancement. So here's an example of a classroom activity that will use this. So here are the instructions. Please read the following text. Then in groups of 2, discuss the following question. So you look, they've bolded the form that we want students to notice without actually teaching it. So you can see here we've got has told, have looked, has worked, has seen, have needed, and then look at the questions. Has anything like this ever happened to you? What do you think the problem with homework has been? Do you think it's useful? Do you think they will study harder? And so students are going to answer these questions, of course, by going back and looking at the text and focusing on this form. Okay, another one is input flood. In this case, they're testing the definite and indefinite article. Not testing, sorry, teaching. So here, again, students are going to read this, and then after, what are you going to do? You can ask some questions, or you can have students tell you the rule. I would use the abductive method here. I would say to the students, okay, tell me what's going on with the articles. Tell me the rule. Why is it why is it the in some cases? Okay, another one could be input processing. Okay, so here's an example where the students look at the sentences and then they have to describe, was it done now or before? So we're actually processing the rule by looking at the sentences. Okay, and then we have something called dictogloss. Dictogloss is, I think, a really good integrated type of method because you're reading, you're writing, maybe speaking as well. So here's the instructions. You intend to teach or practice the use of relative clauses. You may choose a text such as the following in which several instances occur. So you can see this text is full of relative clauses. And then the procedures are down here. So first, you discuss the importance of friendship and different ways in which someone can be a friend. See, always activate their background knowledge first instead of just jumping in. And then you examine the different characteristics of a good friend. Also tell the class they're going to hear a text on friendship. Ask them what they guess the text would include. Explain difficult vocabulary. So see, this stage is so important for your students. You have to activate their schema. So instead of just jumping in, have this kind of background talk first. Okay, so this is dictation. So teacher is going to read the text. Students cannot read it themselves. So they're going to listen. So you read the text at a normal pace. You ask them to write down the words related to the content as you read. So they basically take notes. You tell them not to write down every word because they won't be able to, because you read this at a normal speed. Okay? So maybe you read it 2 or 3 times, then you ask them to get into groups. They put their notes together and they reconstruct the text. Okay. And then afterwards, you have them look at the original text, you look at their text, and then they got to compare and correct their errors. And then later on, you can have them focus on the form. Okay, strategies for teaching vocabulary. So vocabulary here is a little bit shorter in that, I'll get to that first. Let me just talk about strategies first. So when you're teaching vocabulary, you should allocate specific class time to vocabulary learning. Don't just make students do it 100% on their own, but try not to get too overwhelmed with teaching all the words. But what you really want to do, there's a mistake there, is help students to learn the vocabulary in context. Let's just say corpus, C-O-R-P-U-S. And there's lots of resources online where they can, look the words up and see how to use them properly, like what are the collocations and what are common expressions. The third one, which is really important, is engage in unplanned vocabulary teaching. If a question comes up or a word that comes up students aren't really sure of, stop your class and deal with it at that time. And encourage your students to develop word learning strategies, such as teach them how to do word building. So tell them how to use suffixes and what the suffixes mean. Practice word formation through exercises in which students will add and subtract suffixes. Same with prefixes. Substitute various root stems with prefixes. Actually do this as an exercise. Teach them how this works. Okay, focus on roots. So help, extra, things like that. Full, okay. Definition clues. So you can give them definition clues. Teach them how to find definition clues. So if something is in parentheses, what does that mean? Teach them about synonyms and antonyms. Teach them about superordinates. Okay? Show them how to use inference clues. So, for example, find something specific. Peru is trying to restore some of its deteriorated monuments. Machu Picchu is being partly rebuilt by curators. How can they figure this one out? By the context. Teach them how to do that. Okay, show them what restatement means in a text. Some products are designed to stop perspiration, but this bodily secretion of salty liquid. So see, it gives a restatement after, and that happens a lot with bigger words. And then of course, contextual clues. Teach them how to do that. So anytime you give them a text, instead of just teaching them what all the words mean, it's better to try to have them figure some out on their own first without their dictionaries, and by using these type of strategies. So for example, if you have a text that has a restatement in it, don't tell them what perspiration means. Ask them to try to figure it out from the text. And when they can't, show them the second half of the sentence. They see, look, it's telling me the answer right after it. And it's usually the word, comma, and then it has a restatement. Teach them these strategies. Okay, the last one's word associations. So teach them about linking meaning, like fat pig, tall tree, things like that. And collocations as well. You should go through collocations with them. Helps them to learn the words. Okay, so a few things that I want to talk about with word learning. As I mentioned, you can't spend all your time covering all the unknown words in class because you just don't have time, and it gets kind of boring if you focus on vocabulary all the time. So students have to develop their own strategies, such as questions. So they can start to make questions about words. Instead of just immediately going to the dictionary, they should ask some questions like, is it countable or uncountable? Is there a particular preposition? Is it a formal word? Does it have positive or negative connotation? These type of words can help them to guess at least kind of what it is. Even if you can figure out that it's a negative personality trait, even if you don't know exactly what it means, they can still use it to understand the text, and they can look it up later. Okay, that's it, everybody. That's it for grammar and vocabulary. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next time. Bye.